It will not make the evening news, but activists in the fight to get the residents of the district a vote in Congress have scored another victory. This time, a United Nations panel has sharply condemned the U.S. for failing to provide basic democracy to the more than 500,000 people who live in the shadow of the U.S. Capitol. As in the past, residents have activist Tim Cooper to thank. Mr. Cooper, Executive Director of World Rights, joins us now. It's good to see you again. Thanks very much for coming in.
Well, thank you for having me.
Tell us about this latest chapter in, what's turning into quite a long struggle to get basic democracy right here in D.C. What happened?
The statement issued today in Geneva by the UN Human Rights Committee effectively represents yet another jewel in the crown in our efforts to internationalize the D.C. voting rights issue. Not only now has the UN Human Rights Committee come out resoundingly endorsing full representation for D.C. residents in the United States Congress, that has been followed by the Organization of American States and, in fact, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Three major international human rights monitoring bodies that have effectively said, Congress, you must alter the status of D.C. residents. It is, in fact, a violation of international law.
I know you were right in the thick of the most recent statement condemning the U.S. for things being the way they are. Take us through the process a little bit. What led up to it?
Sure. Be happy
what
to.
was said, and how did the ultimate statement, how was that arrived at?
Right. A month or so ago, I wrote a legal brief knowing that the United States was going to present its compliance report under a major international human rights treaty called the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. A long word, basically a short, important idea that the United States government is held accountable for its human rights records by an international body after it ratified this human rights treaty back in 1992. I filed a brief with the UN. I went to Geneva two weeks ago and appeared before the Human Rights Panel, spoke about the disenfranchisement of D.C. residents, and requested that they include in their concluding observations a statement about D.C. voting rights. And in fact, that happened. Lobbied them, met with the head of the committee. Chairwoman Chenet from France was flabbergasted, mortified by the fact that D.C. residents did not, in fact, enjoy full voting representation in Congress. So this was a process of filing a legal brief, appearing before the committee, and then lobbying committee members to get a statement from them. They last raised this issue in 1995, or first raised it rather, but did not provide concluding observations and recommendations. This time, 10 years later, with a lot of work done in other areas, they provided those recommendations, and we couldn't be more pleased.
Is there any reason for optimism that these various expressions of condemnation from overseas will impact the political dynamic here in the real world? I mean, does it, as a practical matter, put us any closer?
Well, the international world is the real world. America, however, tends to be isolated and an island all unto itself. But in the international community...
I asked the question because our acting ambassador to the UN once famously said, that if you chopped 10 floors off UN headquarters, the world would continue without particularly being impacted. So,
yeah, UN Ambassador Bolton is entitled to his opinion. His opinion happens to be wrong, however. We live in a global village, and what America does in terms of its human rights policy matters, and matters greatly. It matters because it sees itself as a force for democracy, a force for human rights around the world. And if it has policies that contravene those principled ideals and ideas, then it undercuts its own ability to move its ideas across the globe. There has been resounding condemnation of the United States on this issue. Various members of Congress feel this. Tom Davis is responding to that. Other members that are aware of international human rights commitments are very, very aware of this. Moreover, there may be a unique opportunity to use the findings of these various international bodies to file a lawsuit challenging the status of D.C. under the Constitution by reason of international customary law. That is a law that we can seek to prove applies in this case, and the courts are bound to respect that.
What would you say to those who might suggest that rather than traveling around the world as an American on the world stage, stay here, be an activist here, mobilize the political situation and try to influence the political situation with the 535 people and the 536 if you include the president who could much more easily right this wrong?
Well, much more easily is a relative term since 200 years have passed despite lobbying, despite protests and lawsuits, and nothing has changed. What the international community gives us is a moral authority, a symbolic weight that we can find no other place. Our courts have said and sanctioned the disenfranchisement of D.C. residents. The international community, international law itself, is the one place in the world today where we can say this is wrong, this is a violation of fundamental rights, and it must be changed. That's a very important distinction and provides us with leverage, historical leverage, I think, to move Congress. It just is incremental movement, but the forces are gathering.
You have to wonder whether if enough international people were to throw this issue into the face of American diplomats and American political leaders and others, there might be some temptation to do something about it just to take that argument away from them and deny them the ability to say, oh yeah, you want to come here and pick on our issue? Well, when you give democracy to folks in Washington, then you come and lecture us about our situation.
Yeah, and in diplomatic terms, that's known as pushback, and we've already seen that happen, as I've mentioned before on this show, in Hong Kong, when the vice mayor of Hong Kong turned to Tom Davis, when Tom Davis was pressing him about more democracy for the people of Hong Kong. He said, you give it to the people of Washington, D.C. first before you come to us. That's pushback. That is the kind of thing that we're seeing more of, and I think that's the kind of thing that will ultimately give us the leverage to move Congress to grant us fundamental rights.
At least a small win for D.C. voting rights activists like Tim Cooper from the UN Human Rights Committee. Our focus here today on News Talk. Tim Cooper, always good to see you. Keep up the good work.
Thank you.
We'll visit with you again very soon.
Indeed.
We'll take a break here. When we come